In this video, we're going to compare SRAM and Shimano mountain bike components. We'll talk about the drivetrain and also the brakes. Starting with the drivetrain, let's first look at the cassettes, and I'm not going to go too much into the gear ranges. This is a SRAM Eagle with a 10 to a 50, so the small is a 10 and the big is a 50. That's a pretty big gear range, and up until recently, SRAM was kind of ahead of the game with the 12-speed cassette, and Shimano only had 11. The reason I'm not going to go into it is because rumor has it that Shimano is now coming out with a 14-speed cassette. So these guys are going to be going back and forth. But I really want to focus on the function of the drivetrain rather than the gear range. And just to show the Shimano cassette, this one is an 1146. So not quite the gear range, but honestly, I really haven't needed much more than a 46 in the back. I'm not sure if I've ever even used the 50 so far on the SRAM. You would have to have a pretty steep climb for a 50 to be necessary. Almost all new modern mountain bikes today come with a single front chainring, whether it's Shimano or SRAM. SRAM was kind of first to the game with the single front chainring, and Shimano followed quickly afterwards. They use a narrow wide chainring so that the chain stays on the front chainring without the need of a chain guide or front derailleur. Both, I think, do a pretty equal job as far as keeping the chain on the front chainring. Both SRAM and Shimano now use a clutch style rear derailleur, which means there's more tension on the cage. That does two things. One is it helps keep the chain on the front chainring. It also helps reduce chain slap. The main difference between a SRAM and Shimano rear derailleur is how you release the tension on the cage to get the rear wheel off. So in the SRAM, you have to move it forward and then you would lock it into place. And I actually prefer that. It's just easier to get the rear wheel off because the tension is completely released. And it's also easier to put a chain on or take a chain off by completely releasing that tension on the rear derailleur cage. The Shimano, on the other hand, has a lever at the top where you would move that forward to get the rear wheel off, and that takes some tension off, but not all of the tension. So it's easier to move the cage forward, but there's still a little bit of tension on that rear derailleur cage. Shifting performance is where things start to get a little bit more different in terms of performance of the drivetrain. So SRAM has a real positive click. You know when you shift a SRAM derailleur, especially when you're going to a harder gear. So this is an easier gear. Now both systems allow you to do multiple 3 or 4 gears at a time right here, whereas SRAM you can only do one at a time going to a harder gear. I actually prefer now the shifting of SRAM just because of that real positive click. Now if you do your own work on your bicycle and change your derailleur cable, I find Shimano to be a lot easier. SRAM has a cover that you have to remove to get to the derailleur cable, whereas Shimano, you have a little screw that we'll look at. So it's just a lot easier to work on, I think. So on the Shimano shifter, to change your rear derailleur cable, all you have to do is remove this little rubber screw, put it in the smallest cog or hardest gear, and just push the derailleur cable out. It's just easier to work on. This shifter is a Shimano XT, and one thing I like about the XT is you can go 2 gears at a time when going to a harder gear. So I push this in, you can hear 1 click, and I push it in a little bit further, and that's a 2nd click, meaning that you can go to 2 harder gears. Now just like SRAM, you can go 3 or 4 at a time when going to an easier gear. Now let's talk about the brakes, because this is where things get even more different and probably more polarizing, because people are going to have their preference as far as the feel and performance of both of these systems. I'll first say that up until recently, I have always preferred Shimano brakes in terms of performance, reliability, working on them, but the newer SRAM, like the guide and the level brakes, have really upped the game for SRAM as far as braking performance and durability. So SRAM brakes are going to have a little bit better modulation. In other words, when the pad starts to make contact with the rotor, you kind of just have more range. You can feather the brakes easier and apply just a tiny bit of power, medium power, maximum power, a little bit better than Shimano. Shimano brakes don't feel like they have quite the modulation that SRAM has, so when the pad makes contact with the rotor, it grabs a little bit quicker. Now the advantage, however, is the fact that the Shimano brakes have a little bit better power. And if you're the kind of rider that you like to lock up the rear wheel when going around a corner, just to skid it around a little bit. It's a little bit easier to do with the Shimano brakes. Now, one of the things that I really like about Shimano brakes over SRAM is the fact that they use mineral oil instead of DOT fluid. DOT fluid, like you use on SRAM, you really have to be careful that you don't get it on paint because it can corrode paint. Mineral oil is just easier to work with. And if you bleed your own brakes, I've found that Shimano brakes are just easier to bleed. SRAM can be a little bit more finicky to make sure you get all the air out of the lines. If you use the SRAM bleed kit, it's pretty easy, but Shimano is just a step above SRAM as far as the ease of working on the brakes. Both brake systems have an adjustment so you can adjust how far out the lever is from the handlebar. I found that the one on the Shimano brakes is just easier to turn. It has a little bit better quality feel to it. I've got another bike that has SRAM brakes, and the knob is getting pretty hard to turn, and it's just harder to grip with your fingers, so I like the adjustment knob better on the Shimano brakes. So that's the comparison of SRAM and Shimano. Both systems are so good today, so if you're buying a new bike, just go with whatever components come with it. They both have their advantages and disadvantages, but SRAM has come such a long way, especially in the brakes, that really I'm pretty neutral on both systems. I do lean a little bit more towards SRAM as far as the shifting performance and the shifting feel. However, for the brakes, I'm pretty neutral. If I had to just flip a coin, I could go with either one. It's not that big of a deal. I do like the performance feel of the SRAM brakes a little bit better for the modulation. However, working on the brakes, I like Shimano better. So as always, any questions or comments that you have, go ahead and drop those below. And what about you? Which do you use? Which do you prefer? Shifting and braking, I'm curious to know. Thanks for watching.